At 3 a.m. on June 22, 2025, the skies over Iran suddenly lit up. Not with fireworks nor signals of victory, but with bombs, each weighing over 13 tons, plummeting from more than 45,000 feet at 700 miles per hour. In the silent darkness, B-2 Spirits and B-21 Raiders of the United States Air Force tore through the night, carrying out an unprecedented mission to obliterate Iran's top-secret nuclear facilities buried hundreds of meters underground. Just hours earlier, Tehran had confidently declared its intention to drive the U.S. out of the Gulf. But now the most heavily guarded tunnels, the supposedly impenetrable command centers, had begun to collapse from within, before anyone in the Iranian government even realized what was happening. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment airstrike. It was a calculated response, timed down to the minute to an act Washington could not ignore. At exactly 2:46 a.m. local time, 2 Shahab missiles launched by Iran slammed into the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, home to American forces. The blast obliterated a section housing KC-135 refueling planes, turning the sky into a hellscape of fire and shattered metal. There was no doubt left. This was a direct strike against U.S. troops. And just minutes later, thousands of miles away, a room in the Pentagon lit up, glowing through the night. Stern faces gathered around live satellite feeds. They didn't wait for more evidence. The plan was opened. And a man stepped in, saying little, just a brief command. Do it. Within less than 30 minutes after the explosion in Qatar, high-level intelligence signals began pouring into the Pentagon. Satellite networks tracked unusual movements of missile launch vehicles in western Iran. Electronic reconnaissance units intercepted command sequences from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' headquarters, confirming one thing. This was not the act of a rogue group, nor a technical mishap. It was a deliberate, coordinated strike directly targeting U.S. forces on a base considered by many to be an extension of American territory. In strategic terms, this was no different than an attack on U.S. soil. At the National Military Command Center, where every American war is monitored, senior officers didn't need to debate for long. They all knew. If the United States stayed silent this time, the entire deterrence framework in the Middle East would collapse. Silence would be perceived as weakness. And in geopolitics, weakness is an open invitation to danger. At 4:12 a.m. Washington time, President Donald Trump entered the Situation Room. No ceremony, no speech. After a brief report, he looked directly at the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Chiefs. He gave a single, unwavering order: make it happen. From that moment on, a vast war machine began to stir. Air bases, naval fleets, and command centers across 3 continents activated in perfect unison, like a clockwork mechanism wound tight. Everything had been planned long ago, just waiting for this moment to be unleashed. And the first to move was Whiteman, the home of the most advanced stealth aircraft on Earth. In the early morning mist of Missouri, the hangar doors creaked open. The massive silhouettes of B-2 Spirits and B-21 Raiders emerged slowly under the glow of maintenance lights. At the same time, aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford offshore, American sailors began strapping missiles onto aircraft wings, fully aware that in just a few hours they would be flying straight into the heart of a war unlike anything the 21st century had ever seen. At Whiteman Air Force Base, not a single alarm sounded. But everyone knew this wasn't a drill. In the dim light of early morning, hundreds of technicians, pilots, and logistics personnel moved like a perfectly programmed machine. They spoke little, quietly inspecting every parameter, every wheel, every microscopic crack on the surface of the strategic aircraft. On the runway, the B-2 Spirit, the symbol of stealth aviation, was the first to roll out. But what stunned observers was the appearance of brand new B-21 Raiders, the very aircraft that had only recently completed combat trials. This time, they weren't test flights. This time, they were real. Inside the hangars, massive GBU-57 bombs, each weighing 30,000 pounds and known as earth-penetrating assassins, were carefully hoisted by specialized cranes. Each bomb was capable of piercing through hundreds of feet of granite before detonating and obliterating underground facilities. At the same time, MQ-25 Stingray support units, unmanned refueling drones, were deployed to fly alongside the formation. Their mission: to ensure that F-35s, F-22s, and support aircraft could stay airborne longer and reach farther without returning to base. Offshore, the USS Gerald R. Ford, the pride of the U.S. Navy, had moved out of safe waters, heading straight toward the flashpoint. On the flight deck, Navy pilots tightened their harnesses and ran final checks on radars and navigation systems before launch. Cruise missile storage areas for the Tomahawk were activated, and beneath the deep waters of the Gulf of Oman, the USS Georgia attack submarine lay silent and hidden. It carried no nuclear warheads, but more than 150 Tomahawk missiles, each one a dagger aimed at Iran's military nerve center if needed. Everything unfolded as if it had been rehearsed thousands of times before. From Alaska to Guam, from Norfolk to Bahrain, American units didn't wait for new orders. They only needed one confirmation. The operation has begun. And so it did. Just as the clock inched toward midnight in Tehran, B-2s and B-21s began to take off in dispersed formations. But instead of heading straight for their targets, some groups veered off, one toward the Pacific, another looping over North Africa. Because this battle wouldn't begin with the sound of bombs, it would begin with an illusion. A sophisticated deception meant to blur the lines between real and fake, leaving the enemy unsure of what was coming or where. And from that very moment, Iran's air defense network, built to protect its most guarded secrets, began to fall into its most dangerous state, blind, in the middle of a battlefield. In the world of modern warfare, victory doesn't begin with an explosion, it begins with confusion. And that's exactly how the US launched its campaign. When the B-2 bombers flew toward the Pacific, they weren't carrying bombs, they were carrying doubt. Russian and Chinese satellites immediately picked up radar signatures, relaying data to command centers. Tehran, long haunted by the fear of a two-front siege, began to suspect that the main strike would come from Guam, not from the west. Meanwhile, F-35 fighter jets had silently slipped into Middle Eastern airspace with their radars completely off. Using passive sensors, they scanned every Iranian radar signature, every ground station, every S-200 and Cordad-15 air defense system. Each coordinate was encrypted and sent back to the operations center. Then the EEA-18G Growler electronic warfare aircraft went to work. No guns fired, no bombs dropped. But with electromagnetic waves hundreds of times stronger than standard signals, the Growlers turned Iran's radar screens into hallucinations. Aircraft appeared, then vanished. Fake missile signatures flew in impossible trajectories. Air defense officers began to panic, unsure whether to trust their eyes or their instruments. And while the defense systems flailed in chaos deep beneath the sea, the USS Georgia opened its missile bays. Tomahawks erupted from the waves, shrieking through the night, then hugging the terrain, flying by digital topography rather than GPS. Their targets: ballistic missile depots, air defense command posts, and Iran's military communications hubs. When the first explosion rocked the outskirts of Mashhad, the second had already landed near Esfahan. Command chains were severed, radars went silent. Iran's air defense was now like a blind giant, massive, powerful, but unable to see what was coming. And that was when the B-2s and B-21s came back. No more diversion, no more hiding. Now they carried 13-ton bombs aimed straight at the heart of Iran's nuclear program, where bunkers once thought invincible would be shaken awake by earthquakes of humanity's own making. Exactly 3 a.m. Tehran time. In what seemed like the stillest moment of the night, the sky above the Fordo nuclear facility suddenly flashed bright. From 45,000 feet above, the bay doors of a B-2 Spirit opened, and a 30,000-pound GBU-57 bomb dropped silently from its belly, like a ghost. In the first few seconds, it seemed to hover mid-air, then accelerated, plunging toward the Earth at over 700 miles per hour. No one on the ground saw it coming, and no one had time to react. This wasn't an ordinary explosion. The GBU-57 is a specially designed weapon. It doesn't detonate on impact. Instead, its reinforced steel body drills through dozens of meters of granite, concrete, and steel before the delayed fuse activates at the optimal depth. When the first bomb struck, the ground trembled like an earthquake. Seismic stations in Armenia and Turkey recorded light tremors simultaneously. But for the engineers working deep beneath Fordow, it was a catastrophe with no warning. Less than 2 minutes later, the second and third bombs followed, dropped from the B-21 Raiders. These newest stealth aircraft, virtually undetectable by conventional radar, had slipped past every layer of defense and closed in with deadly precision. The strikes were timed to produce a resonant shockwave effect, causing tunnels to shake violently, concrete to fracture layer by layer, then collapse entirely. At Natanz, centrifuge halls were pulverized into dust. Control rooms, buried hundreds of meters below ground, were entombed forever. In the skies above, F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning IIs held the airspace. Any sign of Iranian aircraft attempting to scramble was detected early, locked on, and destroyed before it could even reach the strike zone. Below them, MQ-25 Stingray drones worked tirelessly, refueling fighters mid-air, allowing them to maintain presence for hours without returning to base. In total, within less than 20 minutes, a network of nuclear facilities, nearly 2 decades and billions of dollars in the making, was nearly wiped off the map. Satellite images beamed back to the command center revealed a staggering sight: concrete domes obliterated, tunnels buried, and once fortified buildings reduced to ash and gray dust. But the operation wasn't over, because as the bunkers collapsed, the US knew the next threat would come from the sea, where Iran's navy still held a few trump cards. And now, the next targets were set: the naval bases at Bandar Abbas and Bushehr, home to fast attack craft, mini-submarines, and batteries of anti-ship missiles poised for retaliation. As Iran's nuclear facilities lay in ruins, US forces turned their focus to the sea, where Iran's navy still had the potential to inflict damage. Along the Persian Gulf coast, from Bandar Abbas to Bushehr, escort ships, missile boats, and Ghadir-class submarines were deployed in full combat readiness. These were Tehran's pride, key to controlling narrow waters and executing asymmetric warfare. But that night, that pride became a set of precision targets for a wave of cutting-edge missiles fired from B-21 Raiders and the submerged launch systems aboard the USS Georgia. The B-21s weren't just carrying bunker busters. Some in the formation were armed with LRASM, next-generation stealth anti-ship cruise missiles. Guided by multi-layered sensors that don't rely on GPS, these missiles skimmed the sea at high speed, locking onto targets via radar signatures and heat emitted from warships. Within minutes, warheads rained down on Iran's strategic piers, striking moored vessels with chilling accuracy. At Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest naval hub, multiple missile boats were destroyed before they could even leave port. Fires erupted violently from fuel depots, sending black smoke hundreds of meters into the air. In Bushehr, mobile missile launchers were wiped out by a barrage of Tomahawks from the USS Georgia, each strike calibrated with intelligence gathered over years. On the surface, any attempt at retaliation was crushed before it could even form. And while Iran scrambled to protect its coastline, the US also ensured the safety of its core assets. Just 150 miles away, the USS Gerald R. Ford and its escort group continued operations without a hitch. But then, a sudden alert rang out. The destroyer USS Thomas Hudner's radar had picked up multiple ballistic launches from within Iran. Fateh 313 missiles, traveling at hypersonic speed, aimed straight at the carrier group. Within 30 seconds, the Aegis systems aboard the destroyers sprang into action. SM-6 interceptors launched into the sky in a head-on trajectory, locking onto each incoming threat. Flashes lit up the air as every Iranian warhead was destroyed before it could reach the sea. The entire counterattack was dismantled. None of the missiles made it through to the American formation. On the deck of the USS Ford, fighter jets kept launching. No orders to halt, no interruptions. This wasn't just a technical victory, it was a warning. Any arrow aimed by Iran at the US, whether from the skies, the land, or the sea, would be snapped before it could land a blow. And that is why, when dawn broke over Iranian territory, Tehran's generals had no choice but to scramble for whatever remained, to respond. But that response only made the defeat more apparent, and all the more bitter. As the sun rose over Tehran, the sound of air raid sirens still echoed at a few southern military bases. In the chaos of the previous night, Iran had lost nearly all of its active defense capabilities. But instead of retreating and assessing the damage, Iran's military command pushed for one last counterattack, perhaps as a final gesture to save face. Outdated fighter jets were pulled onto runways in Esfahan and Shiraz. MiG-29s, Su-24s, and even F-14 Tomcats from the Shah's era were rushed into service. Pilots took off with a faint hope that they could make a difference. But the skies over the Middle East no longer belonged to Iran. US F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning IIs had established total air dominance. As soon as the heat signatures of Iranian fighters crossed radar thresholds, volleys of AMRAAM missiles were launched from beyond visual range. Within minutes, several Iranian aircraft vanished from the screens, no warning, no chance to evade. On the ground, the remaining air defense units launched dozens of S-200 and Bavar 373 missiles, but they flew blindly. The EA-18G Growlers were still quietly jamming, rendering radar stations completely blind. None of Iran's systems could lock onto a target. At sea, Iran fired a volley of Fateh 110 missiles into the Gulf, but the US Aegis systems were ready. Not a single missile reached the Navy's battle formation. In under 36 hours, every Iranian response, by air, by land, or by sea, had been neutralized. This was no longer a battle, it was a symphony, orchestrated to perfection, where every note of resistance was silenced on cue. And by the time the sun climbed high, the world began to grasp the geopolitical consequences of the campaign, not just for Iran, but for the entire balance of power in the Middle East. When the operation ended, there was no grand press conference, no image of the president declaring victory from a podium. There was only a single brief statement from US Strategic Command, objective complete, no losses. And that was enough. On the ground, satellite images from international intelligence agencies confirmed what no one doubted anymore. Fordo and Natanz, the two hearts of Iran's nuclear program, were now just deep craters, twisted by the pressure of bunker-busting bombs. In Bandar Abbas, scorched hulls of warships lay tilted in smoke-stained seawater. Iran didn't surrender. They didn't have to. But the world understood clearly. In a single night, an entire nuclear program built over more than 2 decades had collapsed. Missile infrastructure, command centers, and even naval capabilities shattered. In Israel, defense officials called it a necessary rebalancing. In Riyadh, analysts declared, Iran is no longer a short-term strategic threat. And in Europe, oil prices briefly surged in fear, then quickly stabilized when it became clear that shipping lanes through Hormuz remained secure. And as the last echoes of explosions faded, the world turned its eyes to the United States with a mix of awe and unease. Not because of sheer power, but because of the cold, unmistakable message this campaign had delivered, a message no one could afford to ignore. No war is ever perfect, but the United States' 48-hour campaign in Iran made one thing unmistakably clear. In the age of technology, victory doesn't have to be drenched in blood. It lies in foresight, meticulous preparation, and second-by-second precision. The coordination between Air Force, Navy, submarines, drones, and electronic warfare wasn't just a show of strength. It was proof of a military doctrine forged over decades. Strike first, strike right, and leave no room for retaliation. Iran tested the limits of US patience and received a response that was cold, calculated, and undeniable. If you cross the red line, there will be no warning, only consequences. And it wasn't just Iran. Any nation entertaining dreams of power plays received a stark reminder that the US, even when silent, still knows how to make the world pause and listen. If you found this report offered a clear, unvarnished, and weighty perspective, take a second to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts below. We believe that quality information, in the right hands, can change how the world understands politics, strategy, and true power. Thank you for watching.